The first sign of Abram Hale was not the man himself, but his horses. They appeared on the northern ridge in the thin light of an April morning, a line of dark, solid shapes against a pale, washed-out sky. Down in the town of Redemption, where the mud of the thaw was still ankle-deep and the air tasted of wood smoke and loss, people stopped and stared. It had been a punishing winter, the kind that scoured the land and left behind a ledger of what was gone. Every rancher in the valley had a tally of frozen livestock, of ribs showing through winter coats, of hope starved down to the bone. But these horses, Abram's horses, were different. They stood with their heads up, their coats thick and gleaming with a deep, healthy sheen that seemed impossible. Their movements were easy, powerful, not the hollowed-out shuffle of animals that had barely survived. They were a contradiction, a living rebuke to the season that had just passed. The townspeople whispered, pointing from the doorways of the general store and the saloon. It had been 7 months since they had voted to cast Abram out, 7 months since he had walked his herd into the unforgiving moor of the Blackwood Mountains with nothing but what he could carry. They had assumed the winter had claimed him and his animals, another cautionary tale swallowed by the wilderness. The sight of those horses was like seeing ghosts, but ghosts that were fatter and stronger than the living. But this spectacle on the ridge, this quiet, impossible triumph, isn't the real story. To understand the weight of that morning, you have to understand the coldness of the evening that came before it, the evening the town of Redemption decided Abram Hale no longer belonged among them. You have to understand what was taken from him before you can measure what he built. The story doesn't begin with the horse's return, it begins with the gavel that sent them away. It begins with a lie, a vote, and a man walking away from the only home he had ever known, followed only by the sound of his own solitary footsteps and the soft tread of the animals he refused to abandon. The meeting was held in the town hall, a plain clapboard building that smelled of damp wool and simmering resentment. It was Mayor Thorne who stood at the front, a man whose ambition was as wide as his waistline and whose concern for the community was a carefully constructed facade for his own greed. He spoke of a sickness, a supposed blight he claimed had taken root on Abram's land, something he called ground rot that could poison the water table and spread to every ranch in the valley. There was no proof, only Thorne's booming voice filling the room, painting a picture of contagion and ruin. He never looked at Abram, who sat alone in the back row, his hands resting calmly on his knees. Abram knew the truth. His land was fine, his well water was the clearest in the county. That blighty was an invention, a convenient fiction to justify what was, at its heart, a simple land grab. Thorne wanted Abram's acreage, with its reliable creek and prime grazing, and he had spent months poisoning the well of public opinion to get it. He played on their fears, the ever-present anxiety of a bad winter, a failed crop, a sudden illness. Abram was an easy target. He was quiet, kept to himself since his wife, Martha, had passed 2 years prior. He was a man without allies, without a family to speak for him. The town, worn down by a dry summer and the looming threat of a hard winter, was fertile ground for suspicion. They needed someone to blame for their anxieties, and Thorne gave them Abram. When the vote was called, it was nearly unanimous. A show of hands, swift and brutal. Banishment. He was to be gone by sunrise, his land declared a public quarantine zone, to be managed by a town committee which consisted of Thorne and 2 of his cronies. Abram did not argue. He did not plead. To do so would have been to grant their lie a dignity it did not deserve. He simply stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the lantern light, and met the eyes of the men and women who were casting him out. He saw fear, yes, but also a shameful relief in their faces. Then he turned and walked out, the door closing on their murmurs with a soft, final click. He left just as the first hint of grey touched the eastern sky. He moved with a purpose that felt ancient and ingrained, a man who understood that survival was a matter of deliberate motion, not panicked haste. His 13 horses, led by his wise lead mare, Dust, followed him with the quiet trust they had always shown. They were his only family now, the last living connection to the life he and Martha had built. The town was silent as he passed, its windows like vacant eyes. He did not look back. To look back would be to acknowledge a world that had rejected him, and Abram's focus was already pointed forward, upward, into the jagged teeth of the Blackwood Mountains. The trail was steep and unforgiving, a path known more to elk and mountain lions than to men. For 3 days, he climbed, pushing his herd higher, away from the valley and its memories. The air grew thin and cold, and the autumn colors of the lowlands gave way to the stark gray of granite and the deep green of ancient pines. He was methodical in his search, reading the landscape not as an obstacle, but as a language. He looked for a place that offered what the town had denied him: shelter, seclusion, and a chance to endure. He needed a place that could be defended from the wind, a place with water that wouldn't freeze solid, and a place that was invisible to any curious eye from the valley below. On the 4th day, he found it. Tucked into the southern face of a massive, forgotten peak was a deep, bowl-shaped basin, a natural amphitheater shielded on 3 sides by towering walls of rock. A small, persistent spring trickled from a fissure in the granite, and the floor of the basin was covered in a thick layer of soil, deep and rich from centuries of accumulated pine needles and earth. It was hidden, defensible, and held the raw materials of survival. Standing at the basin's entrance, with the wind whispering through the pines above, Abram felt the first flicker of something other than loss. It was the cold, hard certainty of a difficult task. He had been given a sentence by the town. Here, in this wild and lonely place, he would serve it on his own terms. The work began not with an axe or a saw, but with a shovel and a pick. Abram wasn't building a cabin to fend off the winter, he was planning to go underneath it. He had seen it once, years ago, in the old country, sod houses dug into the earth, using the ground itself as insulation against the killing cold. He would take that principle and expand it, creating not just a shelter, but a stable, a hidden ranch carved from the belly of the mountain. He chose a spot at the base of the basin's steepest wall, a long, sloping bank of earth that was protected from the prevailing winds. He marked out a rectangle in the dirt, 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, a space large enough for his horses to stand comfortably, with room for a tack area and feed storage. Then he broke the ground. The first few feet were soft loam, easy to move. But beneath that lay a dense layer of clay and rock that fought back with every swing of the pick. It was a brutal, monotonous rhythm that defined his days. The scrape of the shovel, the sharp crack of the pick against stone, the groan of the wheelbarrow as he hauled load after load of earth to the far side of the basin, carefully dispersing it to avoid creating an obvious pile. He worked from before dawn until the last light failed, his body fueled by dried meat and a relentless, burning resolve. Loneliness was a constant companion, a presence as real as the ache in his back and the blisters on his hands. In the echoing silence of the basin, the memories of Martha were sharpest. He remembered her hands in the garden, her quiet laughter, the way she had believed in him even when he doubted himself. He was not just digging a shelter for his horses, he was carving out a space where that memory could live, untouched by the judgment of the world below. He was building a fortress of solitude, a testament to a promise he'd made to her long ago, that he would always endure. The hole grew deeper, day by day, a dark, geometric wound in the earth, a testament to the singular focus of one man against a mountain. As the pit deepened past 10 feet, the nature of the work changed. It was no longer just about excavation, it was about engineering. The earthen walls, heavy with autumn moisture, threatened to slump and collapse. He needed to build a skeleton inside his excavation, a structure to hold back the immense pressure of the mountain. He became a logger, felling sturdy pines from a thick grove on the far side of the basin. He chose the trees with a craftsman's eye, measuring their straightness and strength. Using only an axe and a 2-man saw that he operated alone through sheer grit, he brought them down. The work was slow and perilous. He learned to read the lean of a tree, to cut his wedge with precision, to listen for the groan and crack that signaled its fall. He limbed the trunks where they lay, then used Dust and 2 other horses to drag the massive logs back to the pit. There, he began the construction. He set thick vertical posts every 8 feet along the interior walls, sinking them into the ground and bracing them against the packed earth. Across the top of these, he laid massive horizontal beams, each one lifted into place with a system of ropes and levers that relied on ingenuity rather than brute strength. It was a painstaking process, a 3-dimensional puzzle of immense weight and consequence. A single miscalculation, a single splintering beam, could bring tons of earth down upon him. One evening, a section of the western wall gave way, a soft, sighing sound followed by a cascade of dirt and rock that buried a section of his work. He stood for a long moment in the fading light, looking at the setback not with despair, but with a cold analytical eye. He had not braced it correctly. He was not fighting the mountain, he was learning to negotiate with it, to understand its pressures and its weaknesses. The structure slowly took shape, a ribcage of heavy timber holding the earth at bay, a testament to his patience and his refusal to be defeated. With the primary structure secure, Abram turned his attention to the details that would make the space a viable, long-term habitat. It was one thing to dig a hole, it was another to make it breathe. Air was the first problem. A sealed underground stable would quickly become toxic with ammonia and stale air. He needed ventilation, but any obvious chimney or vent would betray his location. His solution was clever. Using a long-handled post-hole auger, he drilled 3 narrow shafts upwards from the ceiling of the stable, angling them out through the hillside to emerge hundreds of feet apart, far up the slope. The openings were small, no bigger than a man's fist. He covered each one with a carefully constructed pile of loose rocks, making them look like natural scree. The result was a passive ventilation system. Cooler, fresh air would be drawn in through the stable entrance, while the warmer, lighter air from the horses' bodies would rise and exit through the hidden shafts, creating a constant, gentle circulation. Light was the next challenge. He refused to spend the winter in total darkness. In the very center of the stable's roof, he planned a light well. He dug straight up, a narrow, 5-foot square chimney rising 15 feet to the surface. He lined it with flat stones mortared with clay, creating a smooth, stable shaft. At the surface, he built a low, sturdy wooden frame and fitted it with 4 thick panes of glass he had painstakingly hauled up the mountain, wrapped in his bedrolls. He banked the frame with earth and sod, leaving only the glass exposed, a small, discreet skylight that would be all but invisible from a distance. Finally, there was water. The spring at the edge of the basin was reliable, but hauling buckets in a blizzard would be draining. He spent a week digging a narrow trench from the spring, lining it with clay to make a small, waterproof channel. He guided it directly to the stable entrance, where it filled a stone-lined trough he built just inside the doorway. It was a masterpiece of simple, effective design. He had given his hidden ranch lungs, eyes, and a heartbeat of fresh water. The first snows came in late November, not as a gentle dusting but as a sudden, violent squall that turned the world white in a matter of hours. The wind howled through the basin, piling drifts against the rock walls. From the world below, Abram's hidden valley would have been erased, blended into the uniform, hostile landscape of the frozen high country. But inside the earth, there was a profound and deliberate calm. Abram led his horses down the gently sloping ramp he had dug into the stable. They went without hesitation, their trust in him absolute. As the last horse, a young colt, stepped inside, Abram rolled a massive, specially constructed door of timber and sod into place, sealing the entrance. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled, replaced by the soft sounds of the horses shifting in their stalls, the gentle trickle of the spring into the trough, and the quiet rhythm of his own breathing. The air was cool but not cold, holding a steady temperature from the earth's embrace. A soft, diffused light filtered down from the central glass pane, illuminating the space in a gentle glow. Along one wall, he had stacked a mountain of cured hay, harvested from a high meadow during the late summer, enough to last until the spring thaw. In a small, partitioned-off corner, he had his own living quarters, a cot, a small stone fireplace vented through one of the hidden shafts, and his few possessions. The winter that the town of Redemption had sentenced him to endure as a punishment became his sanctuary. Outside, the blizzard raged for 3 days, a relentless assault of snow and ice. Inside, Abram moved among his animals, his routine a quiet meditation. He fed them, watered them, checked their hooves, and spoke to them in a low, calm voice. The mountain could throw its worst at him, but it could no longer touch him. The winter broke late that year. Down in Redemption, the thaw revealed the season's brutal arithmetic. Mayor Thorne's herds were decimated, as were those of nearly everyone else who had relied on traditional barns that offered little protection from the deep, penetrating cold. The mood in the town was grim, a mixture of exhaustion and quiet desperation. It was in this atmosphere that Finn O'Connell made a decision. He was a young man, barely 20, whose family had lost nearly everything. He remembered the quiet dignity of Abram Hale on the night of his banishment and had carried a sliver of doubt about the official story ever since. Now, with his family's future in question, that doubt festered. He'd heard a trapper mention seeing smoke rising from an impossible location deep in the Blackwoods midwinter, a rumor dismissed as a ghost story. For Finn, it was a thread of possibility. Against his father's warnings, he packed a small bag with what little food they had and set off, telling no one his true purpose, to see if Abram Hale and his valuable herd had somehow survived. The journey was a mire of melting snow and treacherous mud. He followed the old trail Abram had taken, a path now barely visible. Twice he lost it completely and almost turned back, but the image of his father's drawn face pushed him onward. After 2 days of punishing travel, he found himself high in the mountains, in a landscape that felt alien and hostile. He was about to give up when he saw it, a single, clear hoofprint in a patch of soft earth, impossibly fresh. It was followed by another, and another. It was a trail. He followed it with a growing sense of disbelief, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The tracks led him towards a sheer rock face, then seemed to vanish into a dead end, a small basin that looked like any other. He felt a surge of disappointment. It was a fool's errand after all. He slumped against a large boulder, defeated. Finn sat for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones. He was ready to admit defeat and begin the long, shameful walk back to town. But as the sun shifted in the sky, a glint of light caught his eye. It was a flash, sharp and unnatural, coming from what looked like a patch of bare ground near the base of the far cliff. Curiosity overcame his exhaustion. He stumbled across the basin, his boot sinking into the soft earth. As he got closer, he saw it was a pane of glass, set almost flush with the ground, covered in a thin film of dust. He knelt, wiping it clean, and peered down. What he saw made him recoil in shock. He was looking down into a vast, dimly lit space, and staring back up at him was the placid face of a horse. He scrambled back, his mind struggling to process the impossible sight. He circled the area, his eyes now wide with wonder, and found the entrance. It was a masterpiece of camouflage, a wide, low door of sod and timber that blended so perfectly with the hillside that he had walked right past it. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of warm, animal-scented air escaping from within. Hesitantly, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The warmth and the sheer scale of the place stunned him into silence. A dozen horses stood in clean stalls, their coats gleaming in the soft light. The air was fresh, the ground dry. In the center of it all stood Abram Hale, holding a pitchfork, his expression unreadable. He wasn't surprised or angry. He simply watched Finn, his gaze steady. "You came a long way," Abram said, his voice raspy from disuse. Finn could only nod, his mouth agape. He walked deeper into the stable, touching one of the massive wooden beams, running a hand over the smooth, packed earth walls. He saw the ingenious water trough, the neat stacks of hay, the small, tidy living area. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a home. It was a work of genius born from exile. He turned back to Abram, his face a canvas of awe and shame for his town, for himself. How was all he could manage to ask. Abram looked around the space he had built, then met the young man's eyes. "They chose the winter for me," he said, his voice low and even. "I chose the ground for them." Finn O'Connell returned to redemption not as a boy on a fool's errand, but as a messenger. He didn't shout his news from the street corners. He went first to the saloon, where the town's ranchers and laborers gathered to mourn their losses over cheap whiskey. He spoke quietly, but his words cut through the gloom like a thunderclap. He described the hidden ranch in the mountain, the healthy horses, the impossible feat of engineering. He spoke of Abram Hale, not as a pariah but as a man of formidable skill and will. At first, there was disbelief, then scorn. Mayor Thorne, holding court at his usual table, laughed dismissively. "The boy's lost his mind," Thorne boomed, trying to control the narrative. Grief-stricken. "The mountain plays tricks on you," but Finn's story was too detailed, too specific. He described the ventilation shafts disguised as rock piles, the central skylight, the gravity-fed water trough. These were not the fantasies of a troubled mind, they were the observations of an eyewitness. A few men who knew Abram's quiet competence began to exchange uneasy glances. The seeds of doubt, once planted against Abram, were now sprouting against Thorn. The argument was still raging when the saloon doors swung open, and a hush fell over the room. Standing in the doorway, framed by the bright afternoon sun, was Abram Hale. He was thinner, his face weathered by his ordeal, but his eyes were clear and steady. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Because behind him, on the main street, stood his herd of 13 horses, strong and vital, their presence a silent, irrefutable testimony. People poured out of the buildings, their faces a mixture of astonishment and dawning comprehension. They saw the lie they had believed and the truth they had banished. Thorn, his face pale, tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. The evidence was right there, breathing the spring air, a living monument to the man they had wronged. Abram didn't look at Thorn. He looked at the faces of the townspeople, one by one, letting them see him, letting them measure the depth of their mistake. His victory was not in words, but in presence. It was quiet, it was absolute, and it was earned. The town had voted him out, but the mountain, and his own 2 hands, had voted him back.